Developing Security Awareness with James Jardine, brought to you by Jardine Software. Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of the DevelopSec podcast. I'm your host, James Jardine, and unless you've been under a rock, you probably haven't missed all the news and talk across social media talking about how on the Apple Mac OS system, there was a way to log in to a system as root or the super admin with a blank password. Now, this is pretty interesting. I'm a Mac user. I know a lot of people. A lot of my friends are Mac users. My family uses Macs. And, it was interesting when I saw this come out. I mean, obviously, there was lots of talk about it. And while you may not be a Mac user, I'm sure you have seen the headlines as they're going around. And I think there's a lot we can learn from this as we go about our own development. So if we take a step back and we look at it, basically the issue is there's an ability to log in as the root user with a blank password. Now, there's lots of things that go into whether this will work, whether it won't work. Apparently, according to the different news stories, if you've got an encrypted drive and your computer's off, then it won't work. If you have your system on, but it's locked with a password, this also will not work. So there's lots of things around this that, whether it will work or not. So, if it'll actually affect everybody, maybe not. There's also, speculation of whether this is possible remotely or if you have to have physical access to the machine. There's some speculation that, if you just know the right calls to make, maybe you could do this remotely. But at the time of the news coming out, it was that it had to be physical access to the machine. So, of course, right, I can log in as root. This is going to make huge news across the waves. But again, I always tell people, read the stories, wait a little bit as information comes out so we can start learning more about this and understanding what happened. I'll tell you, I wasn't quick to just run out and, do whatever steps people said we had to do. It's physical access to my machine. There's a lot of steps you have to do to get physical access to my machine. I'm not that concerned about it yet, unless we come out and say, hey, we've got remote ways to do this. But again, then I'm still waiting to find out how are we doing that remotely, and is that really going to affect me or not? So we start looking at it. There was a good review that came out talking about how this was happening, right? And they go through some of the code base showing how during the login process, I don't remember all the details to it, but there's a thing where it's checking the passwords, and there's a flaw in how it checks the passwords, does the comparisons, and basically allows you to, with a disabled account, log in without a password and basically set any password you want to be able to log in with that account. Of course, this is a big concern, but when we think about it from a development perspective, and when I say development, as always, I mean across the board. We're talking design, we're talking requirements, we're talking actual writing code, the testing phases, all that stuff goes into our development. And if we look at how this stuff comes across, right, this is a coding flaw, so we can look at it as, obviously, there was a mistake with the code, so how do we go about resolving that issue? Is it something that testing missed? Well, maybe testing could have found this. If they've got a test case that says, hey, go try to log in with, a root account or any account that exists but is disabled with no blank password and walk your way through it. I don't know if they have test cases for that or not. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But as we come back from this, right, we're on the flip side of this, we now know, hey, look, we got to make sure we have tests like this. When we're looking at the code base, maybe static analysis or dynamic analysis doesn't find this, right? Many of the tools probably would not have found something like this. I don't know, but I'd be interested to see who's got the static analyzer that would have identified this flaw within the code. If there is, great. If there's not, that's fine too. It's just something that we have to understand. What can be found with these tools, what can't be found with these tools, all that stuff has to come together so we can better understand our development process and we know what's covered and what's not. Now, hopefully, something like code review, especially if we're doing peer code review on these snippets of code, that hopefully would have identified it. But again, that's a manual process. Depends on the people that are actually looking at the code. So if you just overlook it, it's an easy process to miss. So we could have missed it there. There's lots of places that in our SDLC, this could have broken down to where this flaw made it out. And as we know, by this time, flaws make it out, right? Doesn't matter what you're doing, there's always going to be some level of flaw that makes it through. And you know what? Sometimes it's going to be a critical flaw. Sometimes it's going to be a low-risk flaw, and we don't really care as much. But there are those times when it's going to be a critical flaw that makes it all the way through. And of course, the next thing we need to think about is, well, how do we handle that flaw? Right? How do we handle that? Because it's out in the public now. People know about it. Obviously, we want to take care of it because it's going to fix and save and help secure our users. But how are we going to respond to this? What things are we going to say when we're asked by reporters and journalists? How are we going to respond to this? Are we going to put a blog post up? These are all things that when we look at our SDLC, and more importantly, when we think about how we break out a secure SDLC, when we look at a secure SDLC, right, there's that last added item there, which is response. So, hey, how are we going to handle if something like this goes down? Now, of course, hopefully you're not predicting that you're going to release a operating system that has the ability for anybody that walks up to it to possibly log in as a super user. That's usually not on our list. But having an understanding of who the right people are that we're going to talk to, how they're going to react and interact with the media, with other people asking questions, and how we're going to go out the process of fixing the problem and getting patches out, right? That's all part of that response plan of, hey, when we find something like this, how do we work through it? So what's interesting is they were actually really quick. They released a patch the next day that resolved this issue. And I'll be fair, look, I saw the patch come up. I was a little terrified because great, I'm going to have to restart my computer. No restart required. And it took 15 seconds to install the patch to fix this. Now, unfortunately, releasing the patch so quickly, they, I guess, broke some people's ability to access file shares. So the next day, there was another patch, which really threw me for a loop because I'm looking at my update history and I see an update available, but it's the exact same update that was just applied the day before. So I was talking to a friend asking, hey, what, are you seeing this too? And he's like, yeah, I'm seeing it too. It was interesting. Then an article came out saying how they updated to fix the file share up. But it's interesting about this. We are under a lot of pressure when vulnerabilities like this come out to fix them, right? We got to fix them. We got to fix them quickly. Obviously, in the news, we hype these things up to be the most devastating, come up with your own adjective, thing that's ever happened. And as developers, as organizations, we have to understand that it doesn't really matter the level of what this really is or how much this affects. In the media, it's going to be 1,000 times worse. Right? That's what sells in the media. So we have to be prepared for that. And sometimes this could cause us to react a little more quickly than maybe we should have to get some stuff out. Now, is it bad that they released one thing that maybe had broken something else that maybe was less severe in some people's eyes? All right, maybe not. Maybe it's a good thing. Maybe it is a bad thing. All right, they could have maybe fixed everything at once. So why did we release a fix that then broke other stuff? Now, people in development, we know this, right? Doing a fix takes time, and we have to do testing on that. It's one thing to go in and change a line of code to stop this one problem, but how do we know what that affected someplace else? And this is a clear indication that, wait a minute, we changed this over here, and it affected something over there. Now, all of a sudden, something else kind of broke. And that, that's always a scary dilemma to have when we're working on fixing our code and creating patches, because the last thing we want to do is release a patch that breaks something else. And, lots of people talk about this on social media, of whether it was good that they released it, whether it was bad that they released it, was the one item more important to fix than the other item, that they ended up breaking after the fact. And, a lot of that comes down to personal use. Like I said, I'm not that concerned if somebody has some root password to get in here to access my computer physically, because my computer's usually with me, or it's pretty well protected. Now, what if I then, at the same time, require access to shares because I need those. That's where I keep all my sensitive information. And now I can't access that data. Right now, it sways a little bit. Each person has a different idea of what's critical and what's not critical. And we have to consider that. So maybe in some instances it was better. Maybe in others it wasn't. I think, in either way, you're going to catch 22. Doesn't matter what you do. You're going to get destroyed for it either way through public social media. But it's interesting to see how quickly they were able to turn that around. I mean, that's pretty impressive. A day they were able to turn around a patch for such a code base. And to say, in another day, turn around and do another patch, that's impressive, right? Obviously, they must have some stuff in place to be able to do some of that regression testing, to be able to come through and fix this information at that rate. I mean, for anybody that's doing development and understands the size of code bases these days, that's pretty impressive. That's a good timeline. So we have to consider that within our own applications. How long would it take us to push a patch for something? Do we know what that patch would affect? What type of testing are required to go through before we push that patch out to make sure that it's going to do what we're trying to do? So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that we can take about this, and removing, all of our personal Monday morning quarterbacking about what they did or didn't do during their development. Now, obviously, you're releasing a huge operating system. There's got to be countless tests that are going on, right? There's lots of stuff involved with this. Think about your current environments when you release and when you start an application. I mean, everything from design and requirements and testing, all that stuff all the way through. It's a huge process. And you know me, I'm a huge fan of making sure that we have security in our process for this development. So when you're getting ready to go through and build the app, we want these security checks in here. So when we go back to the beginning of the discussion, we're talking about, all right, during requirements gathering, right? We know there's this ability to log in and there's details around that. And we start getting to design and how those are going to work. And then we start looking into the development, the actual coding phase of this, where somebody's been assigned to write this piece of functionality and making sure that we have somebody else looking over that piece of functionality. The way it was put across was that, hey, it's returning an error message. The error message is just getting ignored, and the code is just continuing on. So with code review, hopefully another set of eyes would have caught, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? Like, you're getting an error message back, but you're continuing to walk through this. And, code review can be difficult to pull off. A lot of people have a hard time with it because you have to understand the security concepts. You have to understand the code, right? There's a lot that you have to understand about it. But sitting down with somebody else and just walking through and saying, okay, here's how this logic works. Now, if you're talking hundreds of millions of lines of code, that's a lot of code review. But if you take it in these small chunks, and of course you prioritize chunks like login functionality, then you can sit there and take it and say, all right, let's just walk through it. Walk through it in English, what's happening here. Doesn't have to necessarily be in code. Look at that code and walk through it and translate it and say, okay, I'm doing this. I'm checking this against this value to make sure they match exactly. If they don't, I return this error. But then in this case, maybe there's a situation where, oh wait, I get this error, but then I go on, I have an error. But I don't break out. I keep going and I allow the login to happen. When you say that out loud, right, it pops out, wait a minute, we've got an error, but we're going to log in, right? It makes it that much easier to identify what those flaws are. But this is a time-consuming task, right, to try to embed into your development. But that's how we're going to catch these type of flaws, right? This is more of a business logic type of flaw. Again, maybe static analysis may have caught it, but maybe it wouldn't have. Maybe there's some sort of dynamic tool you could have run that may have tried this and found it, had to hit login multiple times to try to get through it. So maybe it would have, maybe it wouldn't have, maybe you'd have to tweak it to actually make it work. But again, it's something we can look at, but we have to understand. Will it work for that situation, or do we need this? And in either case, having that little bit of manual code review of sitting there walking through that code base and saying, this is what it should be doing, and this is what the code says it's doing. We're verifying that manually, an extra layer of steps. So we want to make sure we have that. And then as we move into QA or QC, right, and we're testing this, making sure we understand the requirements. Does somebody have the job of going through and logging in and saying, hey, look, we got to try different accounts and try to log in with them and see what happens. There's a good chance that you're trying different accounts to log in, but what it sounded like from what I read was that it was a disabled account. It's an account that exists and disabled that if you try to log in with it, it'll allow you to log in. Well, if my test cases don't include a disabled account, they just include making up names, hey, I'm going to log in as John today, and it doesn't let me log in, then we're good. We passed that test, but we didn't do a disable, right? We've missed a case within that test case, and that comes down to, hey, how do we understand the app? We have disabled accounts. We got to make sure we try those ones. We have a super user account. We got to make sure we try that. We have, guest accounts, making sure that when we turn guest accounts off, they can access, right? All these different things play into how we would go about testing that application. And then so that way we can get it out and release to the public, right? And then, of course, if we find these things, then we can come back and we can resolve them and go through. But I don't think this is something that we can just go back and point to one thing and say, that right there is the reason. I could have speculated that, hey, maybe a developer put this in there. They were doing some sort of testing and they wanted a quick way to be able to log in to do something. And for some reason, didn't get taken back out. I don't think that's the case from the analysis that I saw. So I don't think that's the case, but that's perfectly possible within most applications in the development, right? You put something, I've been a developer, I know, you put something in there, a little shortcut to make it easy so that way we can quickly go in and do this stuff without having to retype the password every time, right? We want to make our job easier. Maybe that's something that could happen in your organization. But again, this is something that, one, commenting that to let people know this is what we've done, and two, having that code review come through of somebody walking through that and saying, hey, what are you doing here? And you say, oh, yeah, that's a shortcut I made to be able to log in. Well, we need to take that out. That needs to go. That can't, we can't have a shortcut like that. And a way to look back at policy, look at procedures for development standards. Hey, are we supposed to be doing something like that? Because you should definitely be going back and updating those and saying, hey, we don't do that type of stuff. You can't do that. Log in as you normally would. We don't create shortcuts within our application to do that. And what's interesting is, so I was reading an article about this, and there was a statement, I guess, made from a spokesperson from Apple saying, and I'll quote this out since it's quoted in the article here on The Guardian, and I'll include a link. We greatly regret this error, and we apologize to all Mac users, both for releasing with this vulnerability and for the concern it has caused. Our customers deserve better. And then, so here's the statement that I like the most. Anybody that listens to this podcast will probably understand why I like it the most. It says, we are auditing our development processes to help prevent this from happening again. The key there is auditing their development processes, right? They're not coming out and saying, hey, we require that we need a higher security budget, or we need more security people to solve this problem. It was, we're going to go back and look at our development process, and we're going to try to figure out what happened, and is there a way that we could have prevented this going forward? And to me, that's exactly what we should be doing. We need to go back in and we look at all those things that I just talked about for the last 18 minutes, right? We look at those different pieces and we try to find out, hey, what could we do to help make sure that something like this doesn't happen again, or at least reduce that risk of this happening again by a lot? Does that mean that we need to introduce more code review policies? So people are doing more code review. Does it mean that, there's places in QC and QA that we can make some changes, that we could have identified this going forward? But it shouldn't be a look at just this flaw. It should be a look at your processes and saying, hey, what are we doing? Not just from this instance, but overall, and how can we make this better as we're going through these processes so that when we get out to release, we feel more confident that we've had the right type of coverage to protect us from sending this out to our users. And that's, to me, what it always comes down to is it's coming back and looking at our development processes and say, what are we doing? Is it a training issue? Did somebody not have some sort of training? I would say this doesn't sound like a training issue to me, to be fair. Doesn't sound like that, right? It sounds like, hey, we're doing something and for some reason we didn't do it. This isn't your typical cross-site scripting flaw or SQL injection flaw, right? This is a logic flaw in how that login functionality works. So probably more of a code review type of thing where, hey, how can we make sure we're reviewing these type of pieces that they work as expected? What can we do to help increase that? And making sure that on the testing side, why is it that we didn't have a test case for that to be able to see that? Were we in a hurry to try to get it released? Do we just not have that? Was it missing from the requirements documents so we didn't build the right test cases? What is it that led us down this path? So there's lots of stuff to think about when you see stories like this. I often don't even I don't care about what the article's about. I don't care about the opinions of everybody about whether this is catastrophic, whether they should have done it, whether they shouldn't have done it. What I want to know is, as a developer, as a QA person, what happened? Identifying, what's the root cause of the issue that happened, and then try to figure out how can I take that and apply it to what I do. I'm a QA person. How do I apply that to my area? We have login. Do we have disabled accounts? Is there something I can learn from this that I can put into my systems to make sure that we can learn from what other people do? This is what we do. This is the great thing about YouTube. I can learn from some of the things that people do. Don't jump in front of cars. Don't lay in the road. Don't do this. Don't do that. Because I've seen what it does. We take that, we learn from it, and then we figure out how to apply that into our own development environments so that we hopefully won't fall victim to that. And at the same time, we'll take that information and we'll apply it more broadly. So hopefully we don't fall victim to other issues of similar nature because we're just being more aware of what's going on, how applications are attacked, thinking about these things, that as we're going through them and walking through it, it just pops up and we start building in mitigations and doing things in a better way. So kind of a long-winded thought here on the Apple thing. Again, it's not, I've got no opinion either way against whether, Apple's the devil, Apple's the hero. I don't care, to be fair. I just want to look at what happened and see if we can figure out how we can use that as developers, as testers, all across the board. This information we can use, and that's the only way it's going to be useful to us. So hopefully you've gotten something out of this. You have thoughts on it, send them to me at DevelopSec on Twitter, or you can hit me up, James@DevelopSec or James@JardianSoftware.com via email. Always appreciate any thoughts, feedback. If you disagree, if you agree, let me know. I'm happy to talk about it. Listen, I'm not I don't believe my way is the only way. We all have opinions. We all have thoughts. And the best way we're going to get there is if we share those. And, sometimes we'll disagree. Sometimes we'll see from a different perspective. And that's the whole purpose of this. So thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode.
You have been listening to the DevelopSec podcast with James Jardine. Follow us on Twitter at DevelopSec and visit our website at www.developsec.com for more episodes and information.